In this video, we're going to look at some playback systems. That is equipment used in live music primarily to play backing tracks and other audio to support the live performance. We'll take a look at a couple of real-world examples. A 48-track setup using hard disk recorders, which is used on an arena tour that also happens to have a lot of other crazy stuff going on, but more on that later. An Ableton bass setup using a couple of laptops and a MIDI interface. There are also some audio interfaces out there that are dedicated for playback use, which seems to be a very popular choice now as it really simplifies the amount of stuff that you need. And lastly, my Danger rig, which has no redundancy but is very simple. I use this for playing small gigs. If playback fails, it's not exactly the end of the world, and many other people do it this way. As well as all that, we'll take a look at some other options out there, and we'll also go on a little tour of the stage and some of the other stuff used on that arena show that I was talking about earlier. So hopefully this video will help to demystify what playback is and what a playback tech does and what they use to do it. I'm not strictly speaking a playback tech myself and don't personally have a huge amount of experience working in live audio, but I thought it was kind of an interesting thing and that it's becoming pretty commonplace in modern live music performances, and that some people might shy away from it a bit, not maybe fully understanding it, but yeah, anyway. I also have to thank my mate Cal, who has done a fair bit of playback techery and provided a bunch of useful info. Let's start with the 48-track system. 48 tracks for playback to me seems maybe a little bit excessive, however there are probably other shows out there using even more. In any case, not all the tracks are being sent out for audience consumption and are never really intended to be heard by them. There are tracks of timecode, tracks of performance aids like clicks and counts, and backup stems for all the instruments and vocalists that, if for example, a performer has a problem with their equipment, we can switch over to the pre-recorded part while we get them back up and running. The stuff that is intended for the audience is backing stems like additional keyboard parts, backing vocals, and a couple of sets of surround sound SFX and other sounds and stuff. The system comprises of 4 24-track Fostex hard disk recorders. Yes, this is technology from 20 odd years ago, intended for studio use and not really life on the road, but they are rock solid and keep going. Obviously old stock mechanical hard drives can be a bit of a weak point. They obviously don't like being bashed about on the road or in any scenario really. Anyway, all 4 machines are linked together through a serial connection, so start and stop on all machines is synchronized. It's a redundant setup, so there is an A and a B system, 2 Fostex machines for each making up the 48 tracks. Everything is connected through a switchover system, which is made by Autograph, I think, and is made of a couple of switches, which takes analog inputs from 2 sources and routes them out to 1 output. It can change over from the 2 sources at the flick of a button using sort of relays. However, this is an automatic failover system, so there is also a box which listens to the outputs and will detect if the audio fails on one system. In this event, it will trigger the switcher to change over to the working system. It's basically just listening to one channel from the A and the B system that has a steady tone, in this case the timecode track. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell. In the bottom of the rack there's also a couple of uninterruptible power supplies in case of a temporary power out. Yeah, you know, in case somebody leans on a breaker or something, which never happens in a live show, so I'm told. So yeah, that's basically it. The playback in this show in particular is mission critical as it's the source of timecode which ties everything together from sound, lights and video. It's a show of 2 halves, both acts are around 45 minutes. And once it's going, there is no stopping until the end of the act. No time to pause between songs to fix or adjust something if something's not quite right. It's like a continuous play kind of thing. The musicians just don't stop. I believe this is quite unique to this show, as normally playback would stop between songs and each song would have its own sort of separate chunk of timecode. Oh god, that's fucking annoying. Next up is a playback rig using Ableton. It's another redundant setup with an A and a B system which will change over to the working system if audio drops out on one of them. It uses 2 laptops, both running the same Ableton session. Each laptop is hooked up to a MIDI interface, such as the RME MIDI face, and MIDI handles up to 64 channels of audio on a single optical or coaxial connection. So it's pretty tidy in terms of cables and all that sort of stuff. The MIDI interface feeds into a MIDI switcher with automatic failover. The one used here is the EX box or Xbox made by DirectOut. The output from the Xbox then feeds into a format converter made by Ferrofish, which takes the digital MADI stream and converts it to analog. It was also used as a sync master reference for everything. You know, when you're hooking up multiple digital interfaces, and you always need one thing to provide the clock for synchronizing all the flows of data. Configuration of both MADI optical and coaxial inputs and outputs are used to accommodate the sync source and of course the MADI audio streams. Synchronizing playback on both system A and B is handled by a dedicated MIDI controller or some kind of pad controller going into a MIDI splitter, and playback isn't exactly synced up, well, not sample locked at least. We're just sending stop and start commands to both systems and location points via a mirrored MIDI connection. If we were to synchronize slave system B to A via MIDI, for example, we'd probably run into a lot of problems when system A crashes and then B loses its sync and decides to stop as well. The MIDI Go box is a dedicated controller for playback, which has two mirrored MIDI outputs connected to both systems, and it has buttons for start and stop, program change, and so on. You could also use any MIDI controller going into a MIDI 3 box with two outs, like the MIDI Solutions multi-voltage. Using software like Ableton allows your playback rig to actually do a lot more than just play audio. It can, for example, handle all the keyboard sounds via soft synths plugins and automate the patch changes, so it can become like your keyboard server as well. It also gives you the flexibility to modify the arrangement of your songs when you're on tour. So okay, you want a bigger intro on the song for the front person to talk more bollocks over, then no problem, you can just copy and paste in a few more bars. On a regular gig with a set list, playback usually stops between tracks, allowing the band artist to interact, talk with the audience, ad-lib, whatever. The playback technician will be looking out or listening for a cue from the band or artist when they're ready for the next song in the set. Normally playback will also contain a timecode track for syncing, lighting, mix automation, video and everything else. So each song will have its own chunk of timecode. For example, each song on the set list may have a timecode starting point in increments of 10 minutes. Song 1 at 0, Song 2 at 10 minutes, Song 3 at 20 and so on. On this kind of rig, you might normally have something like 8 to 16 stems of tracks on playback, and sometimes playback might also have a complete multi-track recording of the band or artist, which allows the front of house engineer to build up a mix and sound check without the band being present, sort of like a virtual sound check. The iConnectivity Play Audio 12 is a dedicated audio interface for playback and is a very neat solution for running a redundant setup with two computers or laptops. In more recent years, this appears to be a very popular choice. Effectively, it's two audio interfaces with failover detection, MIDI routing and splitting all in one box. It has 10 analog lineouts on the back, connectivity for hooking up additional interfaces for more outputs, and lots of interesting MIDI features. On the front there is two USB ports for connecting up your two computers simultaneously, and a USB MIDI host port. So Direct Out Technologies also make a box that kind of does a similar thing, the Xbox BLDS Dante. It has network connections for Dante and connections for MADI as well. It can be used to bridge between those two formats, but also does a lot more. Dante, or Digital Audio Network through Ethernet, for anyone that's not familiar, is a simple way of transmitting multiple channels of audio and video over a network. It's a very neat way of routing many streams of audio to multiple bits of equipment with just a few simple network cables. In a redundant playback rig, you could use the Xbox Dante as your switcher and interface. Dante Virtual Sound Card is a piece of software which allows you to send audio channels directly from Ableton or whatever DAW you're using, out the network port, over a network cable to another Dante-enabled device. In this case, the Xbox can accept multiple Dante connections and either route one of those Dante streams, Dante. In this case, the Xbox can accept multiple Dante. Right, in this case, the Xbox, which can accept multiple Dante connections, and either route one of those Dante streams back out of the Dante network or out the MADI ports. In addition to all that, it can also do the failover detection and switching with the system which is called Ears, I think. Again, it listens to a pilot tone on a selected channel, and if that disappears, it swaps to, say, your A stream to the B stream. Yeah, so in that configuration, I believe the Xbox will be able to handle 32 channels of audio. So you could have a 32 channel playback system. Right, last up is my Danger rig. Danger because there is no backup if playback fails or audio drops out. Just one laptop and one interface, dead simple. I use this for playing small gigs and have it set up next to my drums. I am a drummer. So in the absence of a dedicated playback person, it's usually down to the drummer to deal with playback. Alright, so it's simple. I normally use Pro Tools, which has a nice big bar counter, which I can also use as a visual reference for keeping time. A stereo mix is sent to front of house. This could also be maybe something like 4 separate stems, but normally a stereo mix really just kind of does the job. Keep things simple, and small venues don't have loads of channels on the front of house desk anyway. And then I have a separate mix with a click track going to the headphones, which I wear. I can easily queue up a list of songs with memory locations, and yeah, that's it really. It's never failed, and the shows we play aren't exactly the most serious events. Other options out there for a complete hardware solution: a company called Joko, which makes a few models of what they call their black box player, and this is specifically for playback. They've got a 24-channel analog unit which has built-in failover when you use it in conjunction with another one of the 24-channel units. There is also a variety of other 24-channel digital options and 64-channel MADI and Dante players. The Cymatic U-Track 24 is another complete standalone hardware thing, and that has 24 tracks, and you can also use it as a recorder. Connectivity is analog. Apparently they're quite good and inexpensive, but recently the manufacturer has disappeared, closed its doors, so they're not really so easy to get hold of. For a computer-based setup, you can essentially use anything you like really. Everybody does it a little bit differently. If you're running a redundant setup, you obviously need a switcher, and there are a few companies out there that make a variety of analog and digital switches. Autograph, Direct Out Technologies, Nemesis Research, Radial Engineering, and Whirlwind, to name a few. Some honorary mentions. There is third-party software out there for making set listing and controlling the A and B system a lot easier. AbleSet is a software for controlling 2 computers running Ableton in a redundant setup. It is decentralized and so runs on a third device connecting via a network. It actually has a system for keeping playback on both systems completely in sync, and of course allows you to create, manage and control a set list. The latest version also has a feature for performance aids like displaying lyrics and chords that sync with the playback. Strange Electronics also have software for controlling, creating and editing set lists in Ableton, simplifying all that process, making life easier for the playback tech. Okay, so some hardware. From Loop Community, a company catering for the worship musicians out there. Worship music live performance appears to be a pretty big deal out in North America. Playback also seems to be a big deal in that scenario. For a while, if you wanted to find out about playback and redundant setups, most videos on YouTube would have like worship in the title. Worship music, worship playback, worship stuff. Anyway, I digress. Anyway, so that company, Loop Community, make an interface that has 8 balanced XLR outs and a USB hub. So it's kind of a nice simple thing, avoiding the need for a DI box if you're just going for a sort of non-redundant rig. In conclusion, everybody does playback a bit differently. There's not really a standard go-to approach for it. It's about what works for you and what your needs are. In the past, apparently some big pop shows have even used like Tascam digital tape machines. And of course in the 80s, all the synth pop bands, as standard, had a reel-to-reel tape machine on stage. Whether or not it was just a prop or for show or actually was playing back some audio, who knows? Anyway, these days we're seeing more dedicated hardware and software for playback, as playback is becoming way more common in all styles and genres. Yeah, and I imagine like the playback tech's job may become more complex and performance orientated, kind of changing things on the fly, adapting to the situation, kind of like a DJ mixing and sort of looping sections, going with the flow, making everything more sort of fluid in the performance, more spontaneous, less rigid and structured to whatever's coming off the playback. So yeah, don't fear the playback anyway, it's only really just pressing the play button. For now, anyway. Cheers for watching. Hope you found this video useful or entertaining or something. Feel free to subscribe, that would be really cool. Or a thumbs up. Cheers. Alright, Let's go for a walk around the stage of the arena show that I was talking about earlier. There is a mix of old and new tech going on here. So yeah, let's start in monitor playback world. First we see all the comms equipment. Comms are pretty vital, especially on a show like this where communication between all the different departments is a continuous thing throughout the show. They also play a major role in setting up the whole event when you're doing line checks and trying to get everything working. It's a lot easier than running from one end of the arena to another to talk to somebody. This is the keyboard server. It houses some Mac Minis, all running some pretty complex main stage sessions, which always seems to have some kind of weird issues and forgets its programmings, but never mind. These are the kind of things that you have to deal with, I suppose. Anyway, they supply 2 keyboard players, a trigger pad for the guitarist to trigger samples, and some electronic percussion for the percussionist. As there's a million patch changes throughout the show, there is another Mac Mini here running an Ableton session, which is synced to the timecode and fires out all the program changes for the 4 main stage sessions. Next to the keys server is the playback rig, which we've already discussed, apart from one thing. On top of the rack there is more Mac Minis, running a Pro Tools session with a tempo meter map in it, and this is locked to the timecode coming off the Fostex. And its sole purpose is to generate a bar and beat counter for all the musicians on stage. This is because, as mentioned earlier, the show just doesn't stop for 45 minutes, and neither does the sheet music. There's time signature changes and around kind of 200 bars of music to follow for each half. So it kind of helps the musicians to keep count and not get lost. To explain the system a bit further, the screen is basically zoomed right in on the Pro Tools counter, and then this video is distributed to little video monitors all over the stage. Next to the playback area we have Monitor World. This small desk is for swapping between backup stems and the live musicians or performers in case of a technical problem or performer malfunction. This larger desk is obviously for everybody's monitor mix, and there's a lot of people to keep happy. There's also a bunch of racks of radio equipment for the in-ear monitoring and radio mics for the 5 vocalists in the show. Up on the stage we see the 2 keyboard setups, which are basically MIDI controllers, and they're hooked up to the keyboard server, and same for the electronic percussion and the trigger pad. The guitarists are all using Kempers for amp modelling, which are just DI'd, and they all have in-ear monitors to hear what's going on. Effectively, it's a silent stage, apart from the drums. Over here, this was my job on the tour, to look after all of this stuff and set it up. We have a 36-piece string orchestra. Each instrument is individually mic'd with a DPA instrument mic. 2 chairs or players share one of these ancient electronic score readers from, I don't know, the early noughties. They are fairly robust and have a wide foot pedal to advance the page. So yeah, I guess that's kind of better than millions of Bluetooth page turners, which will probably, start trying to connect to somebody's phone out in the audience. Below that you can see the bar and beat display, which we talked about earlier, and this box below here is for plugging headphones into for monitoring. These boxes are all just daisy-chained together and hooked up to a big power amp, so they all receive the same mix. Under here we see a mass of cables, video distribution for all those bar and beats displays. Those BNC connectors were forever breaking and the bane of my life for a few weeks. Yeah, we also have the amp here for supplying the monitor loom, and under here we have all the stage boxes for all the instrument mics. All in all, a fair bit of finicky stuff to set up and break down. On this side of the stage we've got desks for controlling pyrotechnics and lasers. Also there is a desk for controlling all of the motors and things that move during the show, like the fighting machine. And yeah, not to forget Guitar World with the dreaded Persian tar, a guitar tech's nightmare.